Welcome. I'm glad we didn't decide to have this in one of the breakout rooms. I want to start by thanking RightScale for providing lunch. I hope you enjoyed it. A couple of contest winners. Is Spencer Reinhardt in the room? Spencer, you win. Have you been reviewing all of the sessions, or did you just get lucky with the one that you reviewed?
I've reviewed most of them.
With most of them. There you go. Thanks very much. Have you all been posting your elephant photos? So we had a bunch of submissions since last night. Julian Vidal, are you in the room? Julian, your photo won. If you can't read that, it says, warning, PHP 2 still being used in production. And Chili's complaining about it. Julian, congratulations. Thank you. Okay, so several folks asked me about where they can get one of these t-shirts. You can get one of these t-shirts by looking in your attendee bag, finding the overall event evaluation form, filling it out, and taking it to the Zend booth in the exposition hall. You can trade it there for a PHP Rocks t-shirt. I also just want to mention one of the gentlemen on our team, Slavi, just published a Zend Framework 2 book. So that's great to see. I got my hands on a physical copy of it yesterday, and it looks great. So if you're interested in that as you're looking at Zend Framework stuff, please go ahead and go to Amazon and search for Learn Zend Framework 2. And with that, I'd like to bring the panel up on stage. If you've been watching the Twitter feed and other social networking channels, there's been a lot of excitement about the Apigility announcements that Andy and team made on the opening keynote. Matthew's breakout was standing room only, so as I mentioned this morning, we're going to repeat that tomorrow right here in the big room. And why don't we start with each of you introducing yourselves and telling the folks what you do at Zend.
I'm Matthew Wiro-Finney. I am project lead for Zend Framework and now obviously Apigility. I've been at Zend for a little over 8 years and a number of roles, but this one most recently and for the longest period.
I'm Zev Suraski. I'm CTO and co-founder for Zend and responsible for technology and engineering. So I'm working with Matthew and team on the Apigility and Zend Framework, as well as our proprietary products, Zend Serve and Studio and others.
I'm Ralph Schindler. I've been with Zend for a little over 5 years at this point. I've always been on the framework team. I guess now I'm on the Apigility team as well, by inheritance, I suppose. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rico Zimmer. I'm a software engineer at Zend Technologies. I work with Ralph and Matthew in Zend Framework team and now Apigility team.
So I'm going to ask the first question, and then you all will have the opportunities to ask your questions. One hint, you'll see in each aisle a microphone. If you ask your question and you're not standing in that microphone, you don't actually exist. All right, so when you have your questions, please come to the microphones and go ahead and ask away. So the first question is just a bit of an overview question in the sense of Apigility. We've seen some really interesting technology, but give your pitch on what's the point. What can I do with it that I just couldn't write code? You know, PHP developers and developers in general are like, oh, I could write that myself.
APIs are hard, and getting all the little details is incredibly difficult, and we take care of all of that for you.
That's it. And poof.
That's it.
So what do I need in order to start using Apigility? You know, what are the dependencies? Do I need Zend Framework and Zend Studio? What's it take me to get started?
We have a skeleton project called ZF Apigility Skeleton, appropriately. You can download this from Composer. You use the create project command on Composer. It will go and install all your dependencies for you. At that point, all you need is either the PHP 5.4 built-in web server or your own web server with PHP installed. You enable it in development. There's actually a little README that shows you the 3 steps you need to do. And then you start going in and writing your APIs. It does have Zend Framework under the hood. It will install that as a dependency, and then it installs about 10 or 11 different modules that we've created that it then binds together to make it all work.
So, folks, if you have questions, start moving towards the microphone. Otherwise, you're going to get to spend the rest of the hour listening to answers to questions that only I am interested in. Good. So but I do have one more question while they're lining up. So you said that Zend Framework is under the covers, and you don't really need to be a Zend Framework user in order to use Apigility. But I'm a Zend Framework user. I'm all my PHP applications run on Zend Server. I use Zend Studio, and I know it's a little bit unfair to start asking you about what's going to come next, because we've had this running joke for the last several months that every time I email Matthew and ask him for something, his response is, "I don't have time." And what he later figured out was that in the midst of not having time and writing code for 20 hours a day, he forgot to tell me what he was working on, so I just thought he was blowing me off all these months. So are there plans to integrate features to some of the other stuff that we use?
Yes.
All right, great.
On a more serious note, we definitely will be seeing integration into the development tools. We'll probably come up with all sorts of ways we could help you manage Apigility-based APIs using Zend Server, but the approach is going to be quite similar to what we've seen with Zend Framework, so that you can actually use Apigility, and a lot of people will be using Apigility as a standalone, not caring about anything else. Not caring about Zend Framework for that purpose, or Zend Server or Zend Studio. But if you would be using Zend Server, Zend Studio, and Zend Framework, you would be getting, some extra advantages.
Great. Sir?
So I have a number of questions about authentication and authorization. So which standards do you support, which methods, and maybe why? And let's just take the simplest possible scenario of 2 known parties communicating with one another. What's the simplest scenario that you support for authentication and authorization of service-to-service communication?
So basically, we are going to support the basic HTTP authentication, the digest, and the OAuth authentication, version 1 and maybe version 2. So these are the standards that we want to cover about authentication. Regarding the example that you asked for, so it's really depending on the use cases, because if you have to publish, API in a public way, of course you have to be more careful about, security. So it really depends on the use cases. Anyway, the standard so far about, how to protect API and RESTful API is more or less OAuth. So everything is there. So basically you create a token, you have to exchange the token between the client and the server. That's I would say the standard so far. So we're going to support it.
And question to stage left.
So if we have an existing ZF2 project that we're working on, we want to add Apigility to it, how easy is that?
It's actually relatively easy. There's a few modules that you can add in. If you're using Composer, you can just add these as requirements in there. As a good example of this, Rob Allen, who is a well-known contributor to the Zend Framework 2, he actually tried it out yesterday, and he just added these modules to his application, and we were able to get him up and running, and he built an API off of code he already had.
Sir?
So question about validation and what you're planning to use for this one. If you're planning to use JSON schema validation, are you planning to do something with this?
So Zend Framework 2 has a component called Zend Input Filter that allows you to do normalization and validation chains and basically build up these chains in order to validate the individual inputs as well as sets of input. So we'll probably use something like that. What we will do is map the incoming content type that, so we had, I showed that yesterday, that we create content types for each API and service. We'll map that to an input filter and do it that way. We may support JSON schema, but we know that these tools are written and they'll be easy for us to implement, and they'll be something that Zend Framework users will be able to implement easily as well. There's nothing saying we can't do JSON schema as well in the future if there's a good module for doing it.
So what are your plans for growing the community side of things, and are you planning on mirroring just how the development process and community review team and that kind of thing goes with Zend Framework 2, or do you have any new plans to improve the process based on what we've encountered with the Zend Framework community?
So for those who don't know this guy, this is Evan Khoury, and he is a huge contributor to Zend Framework 2. We're just going to clone you and have you do all the coding for us. We want to follow the same guidelines that we've got going for Zend Framework 2 right now. So we'll start evaluating and seeing who's active in the community and who's giving a lot of high quality patches, and start electing a community review team from that. And those people will have the ability to review code and merge just like the community review team in Zend Framework 2 has at this point. So yeah, we have to see who gets the interest and who's doing the contributions over time, so that we can elect people to that board.
Cool. Thanks.
And
It's all right, you can clap.
yeah, you can clap. Feel free. By the way, Evan, since you mentioned that you asked whether we have improvements in mind, it might imply that you think we should be thinking about some improvements. So if you have any improvements in mind we should know about, please let us know.
Isn't that the typical CTO, right? Turn any question into an opportunity for you to help?
You did that too.
So I had sir.
When it comes to future-proofing, what we're going to be doing with Apigility, if there's an Apigility 2 or a Zend Framework 3, do you keep metadata so you can rebuild this, or are we kind of starting from the beginning when those next things come along?
Right now, everything is done in configuration files, and the configuration files are specific to the various modules that we've created at this time. So as we go forward, we're hoping that those don't need to change, or we're just adding stuff. Everything is API driven on the admin side as well. So we can also version that and say, we'll do the version 2 of this, and then there will be a new interface that will work with version 2 and add the, be able to speak properly to the new configuration format. So we're going to version it in the same way that we are expecting you to version your APIs as well.
Thank you.
So I had a young programmer ask me yesterday. He's in I think he said he's just starting his second year as a PHP developer, and he's read a bunch about the web services, this whole web services phenomenon. And so he asked me to explain what's the difference between the web services stuff that folks have been talking about for a while and API-centric design and development, and how does Apigility play into those differences?
Were you looking at me that way because you had no idea what the answer was, or? Well, I think the answer is it's actually the same thing. It's just becoming web services. It's true. I don't think we've been saying at any point that guys, now you're hearing about APIs or web services for the first time. APIs have been important for quite a while. Like I mentioned yesterday, the Keynote. They enable mobile. They enable basically all modern applications. And web services are kind of the implementation detail of how you implement APIs on this web environment. APIs have become extremely important, and Apigility gives you a very easy way of doing it. The news here is that you have an exceptionally easy, fast way of doing it. Not that we've invented some new medium for communications. That was there. Now you just can get on top of this medium very, very easily. That's the news.
So we've heard a lot about JSON, REST-based JSON, over the course of the last couple of days. But what if my client, for some reason, doesn't want to consume JSON?
Everything's built as modules within Apigility. So we have a module called ZFHAL that is doing the HAL JSON format that we actually spit out as a response to you. The way that that gets selected is through our content negotiation engine, and so you can actually define your own rules based on the accept headers coming in, which engine you want to use for rendering. So you can write your own module that spits out a custom format if you want to, if it's XML or if it's YAML or something else. You can actually spit that out and select that. So it's actually built in that way. We will not likely support other engines at this time, but we have the flexibility to make it possible for the end users to do so.
So that means it's sort of designed so that if, for example, there's an industry-specific XML dialect, that industry consortium could plug in a provider that would serve that format.
Yes, absolutely.
Cool.
I want to add to that. In some cases, maybe you're kind of obligated to use the specific dialect of XML. But if you're not, I think that the whole point that we said that Apigility is an opinionated project, we actually think that if you're not using JSON today, you should seriously be considering to move. And if you're moving to Apigility, maybe it's a good opportunity for you to kind of rethink the way the data is being sent over the wire. If you guys attended the keynote earlier today, you didn't hear about a diverse range of different formats that are being used. It was pretty much all as JSON, and there was a pretty diverse range of devices, all talking the same language. I think that unless you have an excellent reason not to be using as JSON, you should be switching.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting that everything was JSON enabled, and maybe it supported other stuff, but sort of the lingua franca was JSON. And it was also interesting yesterday to hear Peter from Google say that he was encouraged that we'd sort of taken the courageous approach of being opinionated in the framework rather than trying to boil the ocean and be all things to all people.
Well, and interestingly, with Google Apps, if you have played with their GData API, when they went from version 1 to version 2, they actually switched from XML to JSON as well. So it's out there. That's what everybody's doing now. So could you talk a little bit about, everybody saw the code generation piece, because that's really cool. But there's specific support for areas like error handling and authentication. Could you pick some of those specific areas and talk about what that empowers, and maybe drop some hints as to what sorts of areas you might attack next?
So basically, about for instance the versioning, that is a very difficult topics, because there are different opinions how we manage versioning. If we move from version 1 to version 2, we have to change something. We have to freeze the version 1 because we don't want to break backward compatibility, so on. So I think this is one of the most valuable feature that we have in Apigility. Also the error management, for instance, you have to care about a different kind of way to manage errors. So we provide by itself using Apigility. So you get all this kind of feature for free, basically, and this is a big, I think, advantage. I don't know if you...
Sir?
Yeah, Evan's probably going to shoot me here, but curious if you have any plans to implement maybe some Doctrine integration, perhaps given maybe an entity class and reading metadata to generate some of the scaffolding.
I figured this question was coming sooner or later. I actually expected that was going to be one of the first community contributions, because we have the ability to generate the DB connected functionality. It's going to be up to somebody who is using Doctrine to go and contribute that. I'm not sure if we will support it by default or if it'll be an optional module that we shove people to if they want to do Doctrine. I would love to actually see it as part of the Doctrine project, much as they did the Doctrine module for Zend Framework 2. But yeah, I figure that's going to be one of the first things that somebody's going to contribute.
Sir?
Hi. I apologize in advance, Matthew, but
Any ETA on documentation?
When we get to it. No, I've actually already, as I've been talking with people over the course of the last couple of days, people have asked questions, I've been able to explain it and realize I need to document that. I'm going to start doing some documentation. We actually have some documentation, bits and pieces were ripped from a module I was doing originally called Fly Restfully. So the scaffolding is there for us to start doing the restructured text and doing this up on rtfd.org. So we'll be doing this fairly soon. There's actually not a whole lot we need to document in terms of like the admin UI. It's going to be more some of the details about if I need to do X, how do I do this? And so having a cookbook around this. It's going to be something that we start on. We have other milestones we need to reach though, and that'll be something that we tackle before the stable release, but we need to get some of these other features in place that people are clamoring for.
So just a follow-up question based on documentation. Are there any plans for a documentation generator to document your API because you're already entering the metadata?
Right. So we've looked at a couple of different ones. One is Swagger and the other is API Blueprint. I'm not entirely sure about the format that Swagger utilizes, but I know that API Blueprint, it's just a markdown document, and we can actually generate this from the configuration we have already, which would make it really, really easy for us to have a module around that. So we'll probably do one or both of those so that you can document your APIs very easily.
So Kyle brought up me shooting people. Who can I blame for what happened in module.php in the root of those modules?
Ralph.
Be more specific.
I think you know, but there's an include in there to a module.php that lives elsewhere, which I've been notably against some of the people that have been doing that.
That's true, and I think if you look at this outside of Composer, you never, see an issue with that. But I don't know.
We can actually solve it with Composer as well. I was researching for my talk later today. I discovered we can do a class map for individual files. So
right.
We'll take care of that. In fact, if you want to do a pull request, go for it.
I was tempted to. I just didn't know if that would start a
no, I won't start a whole lot.
Not interested in.
The only issue right now is that we are also looking at currently when we do our detection of where the module is and where the paths are. That's currently based on the fact that it's further down in the tree, the source tree. So we may need to do a little bit of work around that, but it won't be that difficult.
So I met a cynical developer yesterday, and
no such thing.
Yeah. And so he correctly observed that Apigility is a pretty big project, lots of folks working on it, and as well as other stuff.
We're all up here minus, and he doesn't count.
Well, relative to the Zend framework team, that's a statistically significant amount of resources. So his question was, why would Zend make such an investment? It's not a product for sale. It doesn't directly relate to the products that we do sell. Why would Zend make such an investment?
So should I take it that you don't know why Zend should be doing this? Yeah, so I mentioned this yesterday. We think that the developer community in general, specifically the PHP community, is really in a need for such a capability, for a very easy way of creating and maintaining APIs. We think it actually gives PHP a serious competitive advantage versus other platforms. To us, it made sense to A, create it, because, as I said, PHP needs it, and B, to open source it as a layer on top of Zend Framework 2, so that we can really turn this into a standard, into the best possible way to create APIs. I think we've done a pretty, I don't count, it's not the guys here, I was just advising, but I think we did a pretty good job, but we're just getting started, and a lot of the things that are going to be in Apigility are actually not going to come from the people here on stage, but also, Evan Curry and others. So I think it's just the most sensible way to approach it.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure I've heard Evan Corey volunteer at least twice in the last 15 minutes to start writing code for Apigility. And I think Elizabeth is probably standing at the microphone waiting to volunteer to help him.
Can I just expand on something he said a second ago? I've been talking to a lot of people over the last couple days, and the need is there. You know, people are saying we've been working on an API for the last 4 months, the last 6 months. We've been struggling with this, trying to find, research all the different pieces to it, make sure we're covering all the bases, failing at it, and so they see this as something like, wow, this is going to be much easier going forward, or we can scrap what we were doing and change this. The need is there, and that's why I think it's important that we step forward and said, hey, here's a project that takes care of that stuff for you.
Elizabeth.
Hi. So stepping back a little bit from the implementation details and everything that goes along with that, I want to talk about the idea for the project itself. There are other solutions for this kind of same thing in PHP. One that comes to mind is Froppy, which has been around for quite a while. So what are you offering above and beyond what is already available that is really useful to the community other than being in ZF2, if they already have anything in ZF2?
Right, so Frappy, for those of you who aren't aware of it, was begun about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago by the same team that then developed Orchestra, which was bought by Engine Yard and became the PHP engine for Engine Yard. It is a builder that goes through, you create a route, and basically you tell it what code to execute at that time. So it's very similar. I've actually talked to Davey. Why don't I remember his last name? Shafiq. Sorry, I talked to Davey actually yesterday, and I have kind of known that there are plans for a 2.0, and he's been working on some of the stuff in terms of content negotiation, etc. He looked at what we've done and actually was like, oh wow, I can ditch this now, which is cool. We're doing a lot of stuff with the content negotiation where we actually selected a specific RESTful format that does the hypermedia linking. Those things they weren't doing. And these are things that we feel are important to expose in your APIs so that you can have your clients able to go and, I pulled this user, oh, there's this address, I need to manipulate that address, here's a URI for that, it's all discoverable. And that's something that we felt was really, really important. And we wanted to make a specific stance, this is how that's done. The other piece is error handling and making sure we had a predictable format for that, and it's a standard format that people are revolving around. It's the problem API. So we made a lot of decisions that Frappy actually wasn't yet making, and this helps enable the developers to have these really robust APIs that are predictable and they're going to be easy to consume across a bunch of different platforms.
Okay, so a follow-up to that, are you going to provide any kind of a path, especially if Froppy doesn't move forward, for people who are already using that platform to come to use this instead?
If you're writing your code for Frappy already, most of the time you're writing your models and everything in a way that they can just be, the RESTful API is simply proxying to it and pulling that code and executing it. So if that's the case, you can just drop it in already. So that'll be very easy. The other thing is, well, actually, this is the answer right there. Thanks.
Thanks. Evan?
Sit down.
All right, so on a non-technical level, you're right when you say building APIs correctly is a hard problem to solve, but the interesting side of that is that because it's such a hard problem to solve, there are companies that have come to exist and their whole business model exists because APIs are hard to build. How do you see that kind of affecting the industry for companies like Mashery and others who, their whole business model is based on APIs being hard and you've just made them very easy?
So I think those are actually two different problems. The problem of the challenge of building APIs and the challenge of managing APIs are actually two different problems. And I think that the challenge of managing APIs and kind of figure out what's going on, that's actually not something that Apigility aims to solve. And I would say, yes, there's Frappy and there's a few other projects, but I would say that we actually looked to see if there's something out there that is really like what we envisioned Apigility should be, and we didn't really find anything. So I don't think we're kind of attacking an existing market, if you will. I think that the market for managing APIs is actually going to not be affected, and if anything, Apigility is going to help it become even bigger. And by the way, when I say managing, we actually do say that Apigility is used to manage APIs. We just refer to a different kind of manage. We're talking about the life cycle of the API and how it evolves, and adding APIs, altering APIs, deprecating APIs. This is something that Apigility will obviously definitely offer, kind of already does. But when we're talking about managing, what I meant before when I said managing APIs, it's really managing the runtime, figuring out what's going on, how people are using it, and so on and so forth. That's not something that is currently, at least in the project scope of Apigility.
Good answer.
So, apart from Evan, who's all in on this whole Apigility stuff now, how would other folks, especially folks that aren't currently contributing code to Zend Framework, how would they get involved with contributing to Apigility? Because a lot of the measure of its success will ultimately revolve around what the community's contributions are.
Everything is up on GitHub under the ZF Campus organization. So you can go and check out all of the different modules up there and post issues and pull requests. We already have had people doing that. I've actually merged my first 2 pull requests from community members as of yesterday.
Awesome.
We've had 5, which is great. So you can do that. If you want to contribute ideas or discuss ideas, we have Google groups that we have set up for these. We'll go to bit.ly/apigility-users or bit.ly/apigility-dev. First one is for support. The second one is for development questions or ideas and all that stuff. And also in IRC, we have 2 channels, #apigility and #apigility-dev. So those are places you can go and we can discuss these things. We've had people offering already to actually put people full-time on things like Auth, which is amazing. So step forward. People are already stepping forward and come in and help. We have questions? Oh, yeah.
That's funny because yesterday during the keynote we received the first pull request.
Awesome.
So it was very, surprising.
Thank you, Marco, wherever you are.
Marco, are you here? No. Okay.
Sir.
Yeah, so I haven't had more than one question. I figure I'll ask another one. Given your experience now with making code that writes code that's friendly to the Zend framework, does that open your eyes to other possibilities of how you can write code like API to help us with other business problems? And secondly, can you expose that capability to some of us so that we can write Zend framework friendly modules using some of the knowledge that you've learned in code that writes code?
All right, I get the mic. Since I have the mic, I'm going to give you a long answer. How many, by show of hands, people have written Zend Framework 1 applications? Now, keep your hand up if you wrote Zend Framework 1.5 or less applications. Okay. So it's a smaller audience. The reason I say that is because when I came to ZendCon in 2008 and 2009, one of the key things before Zend Tool was introduced was that when we sat down with people, Zend Framework 1 was a good foundation, but there were some elements of it that gave you a lot of flexibility, almost too much flexibility. So when you sat down with somebody, their bootstrap file looked completely different than another developer's bootstrap file. So that's where Zend Tool came from, streamlining the act of generating code that might look similar to another developer's code. It helps the education process, it helps coming to conferences and be able to talk about the same concepts. So fast forward to today, that's essentially what Apigility is doing for the API market. APIs, HTTP, these are all great foundation, but when you get together, one developer's API versus another developer's API is going to look completely different. So part of the opinionated process is we're saying HAL is good. The way that we're doing the hyperlink media, hypermedia linking, the pagination, these are all strongly opinionated, and next year, when people have started building applications on this, we can all have a similar discussion about how applications are supposed to look. So under the hood, we might be using different techniques to generate code, but at the end of the day, we're building on solid foundations. At the very low level, Zend Framework 2, the module system, that's streamlined a ton of stuff. And then on top of that, APIs, HTTP, and some of the standards that Matthew has researched so diligently. So, of course, this is 0.6, and we've already had hallway conversations about people wanting to do versioning a specific way. For example, if you haven't provided the version, what should you give them? Should you give them the latest version, or should you give them the first version? we're still having these conversations, and that's why going live 0.6 is going to encourage the discussion, so that when we go 1.0, everybody's kind of on the same page. Does that help?
And I'm going to actually add a little here. And you were also talking more specifically about code generation and how we can, share that stuff. We actually have Zend Code Generator exists, and it's a really useful tool. You can go in and create classes and methods and all that stuff. We're actually not leveraging it that much because we have specific templates that we need to do. So we actually ended up using PHP renderer and Vue script and just tossing it in, which was equally easy. But Code Generator is there. We have a new module called ZF configuration that can go and do merging and overriding and stuff of the configuration files themselves. This stuff is all out there now. You can start using it and consuming it today. So the code exists. Some of it's existed for a while even.
The middle part of the question was, with your experience now, do you see new horizons of, I'm not trying to get you to announce something that you can't, but are there new horizons that you've seen based on this, problems that you solve for us?
Yeah.
I guess that's fair.
But yeah, and one thing I want to note too is we're actually not generating that much code. We are mostly generating stub files, and that you are going to go in and fill in. We're actually specifically staying away from generating too much code because we don't want to do that. We want to just have something that you can go in and fill in. You have a place to do it. But we're not generating all that much. It's just a little bit of structure for you. I think that's a better approach because it leaves the control in your hands as a developer. You still have to do something, right? And that's what we want you to do that because you're the one building the business value around the API, so you know what you need to do. We don't. We're just giving you a way to do it, structure it, so that we can then do something with what you return and expose it for you.
Sir?
Yeah, so Apigility is an opinionated API framework. Is there any thoughts or any plans on an opinionated client to go with that to help?
Yeah, I've actually prototyped one already, and we have two different approaches we're looking at. The one I did was just using HTTP client from ZF2 and adding some awareness of the HAL format so that we can go and utilize it. Enrico wrote earlier this year a Zend Service API, which is really a configuration-driven way of accessing web services and getting responses back. One of the things we were talking about yesterday was that perhaps we'll merge the efforts I did so that it becomes aware of HAL and it returns these objects, these structured objects back to you. So yes, that is definitely in the works.
Actually, I'll take that in a little bit different of a direction. What I've seen happen over the past couple of years is people are splitting their application and decoupling it. On one side, you've got an API server. On the other side, you've got a front end. And the big question now is, what does that front end look like? So while we're delivering Apigility as an API, you could do one of two things at this point. You could develop another PHP application that consumes that API, or you could kind of step into the HTML5 arena and look at the landscape of if you're building a website, all the clients that are out there, the Angular JSs, the Backbones, the Embers. We personally have decided on using Angular JS. It had awareness of in some way, shape, or form, it had awareness of HAL already. We found a good client for that, and it helped us be able to utilize technologies that just came out, Bootstrap 3, the latest versions of Angular. So that's a new and exciting way of developing applications. If you go on the IRC channel for Angular, there's tons of developers. Like, people are excited about that technology. So Apigility helps employ or facilitate that style of development.
Evan?
Having written the configuration merging stuff in Zend Framework 2, could you give us kind of a high-level overview of what the problem is that the ZF configuration module that you've thrown in there solves?
Right. This is the ZF configuration module is actually about working with the files themselves versus the in-memory graph. So we want to be able to manipulate those files and write them back to disk is what it comes down to.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what it's solving, and then we have exposed that as an API so that you can see the merged configuration, and then you can write to it, and yeah, it's all there.
Cool.
Yeah, a larger discussion to that might be whether or not it belongs in Zend Framework 2 proper, in Zend config. I mean, that's definitely something on the table.
Sir?
Part of a successful API is speed. It needs to be quick. So A, have you done any sort of benchmarks? B, how are you planning on maybe streamlining the runtime process? And C, how do you see this affecting, say, the skeleton application for ZF2?
We haven't been doing any benchmarking because we kind of know the baseline benchmark for Zend Framework 2. One of the things I've looked at, though, is there are a whole bunch of services that are currently enabled by default in Zend Framework 2 that are really unnecessary for delivering the APIs. So if all your application is going to be doing is delivering APIs, we can actually probably remove a lot of those services and help slim it down is what it comes down to. So we would have a dedicated, basically a performance version of the skeleton that we can turn on the switch that would disable these services by default. So that's one of the pieces where I've been looking at personally. Another one that we've looked at is the Falcon project has this new language for basically writing in PHP, something that then compiles to a PHP extension. And we're looking at taking the most performance-heavy pieces, the service manager, the event manager, and potentially making PHP extensions out of these, and then you would be able to have this nice streamlined API just by having those on your server right there. So those are some of the pieces we're looking at right now.
So the Apigility team is, at least in my opinion, written an amazing amount of code in an amazingly short period of time. And so you've been so fully immersed in thinking about this for a couple of months now, without asking you to talk about specific features or deliveries. Can you talk about, based on the work that you've done so far, what sorts of things are you starting to be excited about that, hey, when we get to stable version 1 release, we can look at doing this or that? Ralph.
Well, without naming names, many prototypes of this have existed over the past year. Well, I guess I could name names. We had Zend Server Gateway, and then Matthew had Fly RESTfully. So we've seen kind of the outer limits of what this style of product could do. Some of the things I'm excited about that were in Zend Server Gateway were per route-based parameter filtering and validation. It's neat to be able to say, all right, when this route's here, there's going to be a key that comes in, just check it against this input filter, and that's before it ever hit your own code. So that's a key feature that I think is really interesting and neat, and something that's been prototyped long before 0.6 of Apigility.
That's actually something that addresses your question just a moment ago about the performance as well, as we're looking at things like authentication and input filtering as things that we can do to intercept the call before it even hits the heavy stuff. Because if we can do the validation before we ever need to invoke anything else, we can return it really quickly and reduce the overhead by half or more. I love that. I think that's great because it's less code being executed. It's much faster. For me, as I was putting together the demo for ZendCon, it was amazingly, I had what you saw me do during the demo. I had the database. I wrote the Angular applications separately. I basically knew what the schema for the database looked like and what the API would look like as a result. I wrote that in about 20 minutes or thereabouts, and then I just started going through the API generation and everything, just like I did on screen, and it worked exactly like that. And I thought that was just a huge win. I was fast. I knew what I wanted to build. I knew what the API needed to expose. I wrote this Angular JS application really quickly, and I was done. I spent more time tweaking the layout and doing pagination, making sure I had pagination that seemed reasonable. I did more with that than the API itself, which was great. I like that. If you have a good front-end team, they're going to be able to do that quickly, and you're just exposing your code. And I love that.
So how is how is that? So you just touched on a really important point. In the role that I held before I came to Zend, the company I worked for was building a mobile operating system, and I focused on the apps ecosystem. And so performance in that context meant something very different than time to first byte, how long it took to render the page. One of the primary issues of performant programming was to be able to have client-server interactions between the phone device and the server with as few bytes as possible, right? Because that was the bottleneck, and that was also the expense increment for the consumer. So how will Apigility help me as I need to tailor and version the specifics of my API to solve the particular needs of my customer base?
That's one of the reasons we chose JSON, actually, as you have these smaller responses that come up right off the bat. If you look at XML, you are naming each tag, and then you also are naming it again at the end. And so there's extra characters constantly. So that's actually one of the reasons for JSON right there. Now that doesn't solve all the problems because you still have a lot of bits in there. But those are things that you can also solve at the app server level. So we can do things like gzipping or bzipping at the app server level so that it's coming back faster and with a smaller payload as well. And we can do that negotiation at the client. The other thing is because everything is built on top of Zend Framework 2, we can also be putting things in there to, for instance, we have a stream writer and the response layer already, and we could be starting to push this in there so that the first byte's getting there right away, and then it just streams in and you're able to start consuming it. So there are things we can do because of the architecture that we are building on from Zend Framework 2 to accommodate that as well.
Great. Sir?
Yeah, first let me say it looks really cool. I'm excited to try it. Love that. My understanding is you're not, like you say, you're not generating much code, you're generating configuration, and we get to do the code. My question is, every framework, obviously their blog walkthrough or whatever works ridiculously well with their framework, hopefully, or it's a horrible documentation. Outside of like what you showed at the keynote, which worked and was great, but like those contrived examples, have you guys as a team applied it to any of the APIs maybe you've built, for other things at Zend? And apologies if I've missed you referencing that.
So the example API that you may have seen it was a link up there at the top of the menu bar there. That one is actually one that I've done on a couple of different occasions. It's a database, kind of like a Twitter clone sort of thing that I had been working on and trying to expose in a number of different ways. I was able to do that with Apigility very quickly, and it was very intuitively. I worked on one today. Rob Allen, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but he already had something that he had the models, he had everything was in place already for the code. He just wanted to see how he could expose it by an API. He had one configuration issue because he wasn't importing the entire skeleton. He was just importing some elements, and we hadn't documented we needed this particular abstract factory. I put that in there, and it was immediately exposed. So, yeah, you can just drop in anything. I've thrown quite a bit at it. I'm sure people will find something that doesn't work, but we'll work on those pieces. And it may be that we already support it. We just need to do a little tweaking to the configuration by hand. But we'll start documenting those things as we go.
One more follow-up if I can. How comfortable, if I don't want to use the web interface, how comfortable am I going to be configuring things maybe manually? I know it might be more time consuming, but until I'm comfortable using that to generate the configuration, is it reasonable for me to attack it that way?
Yeah, there's two different ways you can. One is that everything that is on the web interface is an API already. So you can use HTTP, you can use curl, whatever, to make those requests at the command line and do it. The other thing is every single one of the modules in the module.config.php that we have documents all the different options that are available so that you can go in and figure out how you configure it by manually if you want to.
Mr. Curry.
Sorry, I keep coming up here. Actually, I'm kind of glad he asked that question. So having hired a lot of people, I found that frameworks like Rails, for example, tend to create this breed of developer, if you will, that don't actually understand how their applications that they're building work, because the framework takes care of so much of it for them. Is there anything we can do, as a project with Apigility to make sure that we don't create those problems and that the developers getting involved in this while we're making it easy remain educated on what it is that they're actually doing.
So I was actually having this conversation with Stefan Preepsch earlier, because he is always leery of all this magic stuff happening and people not understanding. And when we were talking, I said, we have developers like him who are really experienced. They've been doing this for over a decade. They're brilliant. And then you've got the other 999 developers in the room who have less experience and for whom they don't really want to understand. They don't have the time to understand it right now. So we are catering right now to that because they want to be able to just get up and running. They don't want to have to necessarily learn how the event manager works and how the service manager works and everything. That said, that stuff is all there, and we can point them to this information for how they can use that under the hood with Zend Framework if they want to. How we do that is going to be interesting, and we're going to have conversations about that. We'll have to show how it all works at some point so that the advanced users can go through and make those changes to their code if they want to, tweak the engine if they want to. But it's not really the priority. The priority is enabling developers to create these APIs at this point. If it solves that, I'm happy at this point.
Sir?
So Apigility can support like RESTful services and RPC services, right? Any plans to implement like code generation for Thrift services?
Not right now. Are you going to contribute it?
Can I? Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things we're trying to also keep things, we are trying to be opinionated and how much we do there. We don't want to have so many different features that people have to choose from. But as I've said before, everything right now is as a module, and there are ways to choose, basically configure to do other pieces if you want to. So we can configure the content negotiation to use a different renderer if we want to. So you can write these modules. We may not accept them, but you can start popularizing them and saying, hey, if you're doing Thrift with Apigility, here's a module that will take care of that for you. And people can start dropping it in. So that's the other thing to be cognizant of, is that we are going to continue to be an opinionated framework, but it's modular and flexible enough that you should be able to do what you want if you need to.
Could you also describe the process of if I want to contribute certain modules, what will be the process of submitting requests, creating prototypes, something?
Right. So right now we've got the mailing list, the dev mailing list, and you'll probably want to submit there, and we'll start a discussion. If it's a new module, that means a new repository. So we'll likely have to have some sort of voting process around that. We may even need to open a repository for those discussions. I've seen a couple of other projects have an RFC repository, so people can go and do pull requests with a new RFC, and they can work on it and collaborate with people in order to get this RFC together. Very likely we'll do something like that, simply because everything is a module in here. It's not like a monolithic framework.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hi. First of all, thank you for, I think this is a really great evolution from Zend Server Gateway. What does that mean for Zend Server Gateway, though? And will it replace Zend Server Gateway? I think this is really what I wished Zend Server Gateway was last year, being open source and being a quote-unquote real Zend Framework project. The other one was real too, not to say, but it was just organized in a way that the community doesn't necessarily do it. So.
Yeah, so I definitely think you can view Apigility as the successor of Zend Server Gateway. All of our efforts are going to go into this, so we'll help people migrate as necessary from Zend Server Gateway, but the focus from this point onwards is going to be Apigility. Like you said, I think this is, you discovered it as what you've always wished Zend Server Gateway would have been, so that's what we're going to focus on this point onwards.
And as far as the Zend Studio integration and so forth, is that on the roadmap?
It is. I mentioned this earlier, but we will definitely have the ability to interact with Apigility from within Zend Studio. like Matthew mentioned, all of the UI that does exist, we either have the option of embedding it into Zend Studio as is, but it's also completely API based, so we may also tailor a native UI communicating with the same services. But one way or another, we'll definitely implement it, and future version of Zend Studio is going to replace Sensible Gateway with Apigility.
All right, thanks.
So I do my own dev on a Linux box, but I travel a lot. I travel with a Mac, and I may have a Windows box sitting around somewhere. It runs all three. How do I get it up and running?
I've only done it on Linux, so Ralph?
I know.
Well, it is the easiest use case clearly is Composer. If you're familiar with the command line, especially in Windows, through Console 2 or whatever it is that you utilize, it's as easy as create project, and then you get the skeleton and install as dependencies. All three of us probably use more often than not the built-in PHP 5.4 web server. So that's the easiest way that we've been able to just kick it up and get it running.
And where do folks find information about how to do that?
Apigility.org.
Sir?
So you've talked a lot about the framework being opinionated, and you've touched on some of the areas where you feel that it is. I was curious if you kind of go into that a little more depth and talk about the areas where you think that it may be most controversial or most interesting or most important.
So the first one was, what response format do we send back? If you look at the area of JSON APIs, there are a variety of them out there in terms of the formats, and more often than not, people are just making up their own formats. One of the things we wanted to do was enable hypermedia linking and go full Richardson maturity model level 3, which means that as every resource that you request has a self-referential link, it links to the other resources in there. It's able to embed resources, and you're able to address those directly. So we wanted to enable that, and to do that, that meant we needed to have some sort of standard format. We decided not to just make one up, and we looked around. I surveyed a whole bunch of them earlier this year. Hypermedia application language is what I ended up thinking was probably the best implementation I've seen of hypermedia APIs in JSON. And so that was the first opinion we chose. The next one was had to do with how are we going to expose problem details. So if an exception occurs when we have bad content negotiation, all of that stuff, how are we going to expose that? And again, we could have just made up a format, or we could look and see if there was one that existed. And we went with the problem API from Nottingham Drafts, and it's now an IETF proposal. So that's what we ended up saying. We're going to use this and not another one. I've looked at VND error in terms of implementation. It was going to be very hard. API problem or problem API. It's API problem on the content type that it uses, but it's called problem API. This one has all the details that you need in order to expose that. The other piece that we needed to do was with versioning and how do we want to do that. And we actually decided not to have an opinion on this one, other than we'll support both URL versioning as well as hypermedia content type versioning. And that's really where we want to steer people to, just have a single URL, use the accept header and your content type in order to make the requests and determine what version you want to use. So those are a lot of the opinions we were doing there. Another opinion that we had was with RPC. We decided it was going to be one route, one controller. That's it. We didn't want to try and break it down by methods or anything like that. It's just one route, one controller. So that made it really easy. It makes it easy for you as a developer to go in and do the negotiation dance if you want to. So those are a lot of the pieces right there. We've made a number of other little decisions here and there, like how we do options and what we expose in options, that sort of thing. But they're less important. But those, a format for the payloads, a format for the errors, those were the important decisions we had to make, and saying this is what our APIs will look like.
I think another important decision, which I think we made in the last 2 weeks, when versioning was actually implemented, was how would we achieve it in a code sense. And I think it's pretty unique to our project, and so far I like the solution we've come up with, which is essentially looking at your model or your controllers, your entities, your resources, those things that you created, and doing essentially a copy-paste and putting those things in a namespace for you. So we're utilizing PHP's built-in namespaces to also do HTTP API versioning for you. So it's the choice we made, and looking back on it, I think it's a good one.
Right. Sir?
You've already kind of touched on the industry's move towards Angular or JavaScript MVC applications. But if, say, we wanted to build our application to have the presentation layer on the server side, would you recommend still accessing that RPC or REST APIs on the same box? Or is there a way of accessing a level deeper into Apigility, or would you recommend just going straight to the service or model layer that is already exposed?
Yeah, so you're saying like if you have an application that is going to consume the same code, basically?
Yeah, an
Right.
application that if we wanted to put our view layer in an MVC framework on the server side.
Right. So yeah, you can totally do that. The idea that we have is that you are going to write your code that basically models your business logic, so your model or your service layer, and you're going to write that code. And right now, the Apigility, you are just then putting that code in there and you are calling it. So if you've already written that code, why not just call it from your MVC layer and expose it? But then you can also expose it by the API layer very easily. I would just call your code.
The service or model code that's?
Yeah, okay. Just call that, yep, just call that directly. As an example, the joined in code that I wrote yesterday for the demo, yeah, I can invoke that completely independent of the API if I want to, and if I wanted to have a page that went and did that and cached the results or something and did it, I could do that, or I can expose it as an API because I have that code written already.
Things like the paginator that exists in Apigility, is that something that would have to be duplicated in a separate view layer then, or is that accessible?
It's accessible. The way that we actually accomplish that is we have a collection object that extends the paginator, and that's it. So because it's extending the Zend paginator, you can pass that into your views, or you can use it within the API engine, either one.
Great. I've got a couple of items of housekeeping before we wrap up, but before we close, I want to thank all the guys in the Apigility team, not just for the amazing effort over the last couple of months, but for the courage to agree to come in front of a room full of people and have them throw questions at you about what you've immersed yourself in for thousands of hours over recent weeks. So thank you very much. And if we could just really quickly switch to the podium display. So just a couple of notes, folks. If you haven't already got your chili, your red elephant, you're running out of time. So find that card in your elephant. Find the elephant card hunt in your attendee bag and get your shot at getting a version of chili. I mentioned earlier this is the event T-shirt. Also in your attendee bag, fill out the overall evaluation for the event. Take that card to the Zend booth in the expo hall, and you can trade that for a PHP Rocks shirt. And I also want to remind you that tomorrow, midday, we're going to have a similar panel on the continuous delivery efforts that Zend has been engaged in, and hopefully we'll see you at that as well. So with that, thanks very much to the team. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of ZendCon.